Don't move." The lethal command froze the diner. Leah couldn't breathe. The heavy porcelain tray slipped from her trembling fingers, shattering violently against the linoleum. The harsh fluorescent lights flared into a blinding white abyss, and her fragile knees finally buckled. She braced for the cold floor, but strong, unyielding arms caught her mid-fall. The sharp scent of rain and expensive cologne enveloped her fading senses. She blinked weakly up at the city's most ruthless mafia boss. Lincoln's dark, calculating eyes weren't on her face. They were locked onto the gruesome, violent ring of purple bruises freshly exposed on her pale throat. The temperature in the room plummeted as his jaw clenched, his voice cutting through the silence like a serrated blade. "Who hurt you?" The relentless, driving rain hammered against the large, grease-stained plate glass windows of the diner, distorting the streetlights into smeared streaks of sickly yellow and violent red. Inside, the atmosphere was suffocatingly thick, heavy with the overwhelming scent of stale frying oil, burnt filter coffee, and the quiet desperation that always accompanied the graveyard shift. Leah stood behind the chipped laminate counter, her slender fingers gripping a damp gray rag with a knuckles-white intensity. She dragged the cloth across the surface in slow, mindless circles, trying desperately to anchor herself to the physical world. Her shift had started 14 agonizing hours ago, and the exhaustion was no longer just a physical sensation. It was a living, breathing entity draped over her shoulders, dragging her down toward the cracked linoleum floor. Every single joint in her body screamed in protest with the slightest movement, and a dull, rhythmic throbbing hammered away at the base of her skull. But the physical pain of the grueling work was nothing compared to the sharp, agonizing fire that radiated from her ribcage and neck with every shallow breath she took. She adjusted the high, stiff collar of her faded pink uniform, wincing as the rough polyester fabric brushed against the tender, swollen, and mottled flesh hidden beneath. The diner was mostly empty, occupied only by a few hollow-eyed truck drivers nursing their third cups of coffee and a solitary, disheveled man sleeping off a bender in the furthest corner booth. The only sound, aside from the torrential downpour outside, was the erratic, buzzing hum of the neon open sign and the slow, agonizing ticking of the clock above the kitchen door. Leah closed her eyes for a fleeting second, praying for the final 2 hours of her shift to miraculously evaporate. She needed to get back to the cramped, freezing apartment she called home, lock the flimsy deadbolt, and collapse into the momentary oblivion of sleep before the cycle began all over again. Suddenly, the rusted bell above the front door violently jingled, the sound unnaturally loud and sharp in the stifling quiet. A blast of freezing, rain-soaked air swept through the diner, carrying with it an undeniable, heavy shift in the atmosphere. It wasn't just cold. It was an oppressive, suffocating weight that settled instantly over the room. Leah opened her eyes and froze, her breath catching painfully in her bruised throat. The few patrons who had been awake immediately lowered their heads, fixing their gazes firmly on their cold plates or into their dark coffee, suddenly deeply fascinated by the absolute nothingness before them. Even the sleeping drunk stirred, instinctively shrinking back into the worn vinyl upholstery. 3 men had stepped out of the raging storm and into the harsh fluorescent light. 2 of them were massive, built like brick walls, their dark suits practically bursting at the seams. Their eyes were cold, professional, and constantly scanning the perimeter. But it was the man standing directly between them who commanded every ounce of the room's oxygen. Lincoln. Even in a city overrun by shadows and violence, his name was spoken only in hushed, terrified whispers. He moved with the slow, terrifying grace of an apex predator that knew it had no natural enemies. His dark, tailored overcoat was damp from the rain, clinging to broad, powerful shoulders. His sharp, aristocratic features were cast in shadow, but his eyes, dark, calculating, and chillingly devoid of warmth, swept over the diner in a fraction of a second, cataloging every exit, every person, every potential threat. Leah's heart began to hammer against her bruised ribs like a trapped bird. Sam, the elderly diner owner who had been wiping down the espresso machine, took one look at the new arrivals, dropped his towel, and practically scrambled backward into the safety of the kitchen, leaving Leah entirely alone to face the storm that had just walked through their doors. Lincoln and his men bypassed the front counter and moved slowly toward the largest, most secluded booth in the back corner. They sat down in unison, a silent, perfectly choreographed maneuver. The two heavily built guards slid into the sides, while Lincoln took the center seat, facing the entire restaurant. He didn't pick up a menu, he didn't look at the specials board, he simply sat there, radiating an aura of absolute, terrifying control. "Leah," Sam hissed from the small kitchen window, his face pale and slick with panicked sweat. "Get out there. Bring them coffee. Don't look at him too long. Don't ask questions. Just pour the coffee and get out of his way." Leah swallowed hard, the movement sending a fresh, agonizing spike of pain up her bruised neck. Her hands shook violently as she reached for the large commercial coffee pot. The glass carafe felt as heavy as a cinder block. She took a deep, shuddering breath, trying to steady her erratic pulse, and stepped out from the relative safety behind the counter. The walk from the counter to the back booth felt like a march to the executioner's block. The floor seemed to stretch and distort, the distance becoming an endless, terrifying void. With every step, the sheer presence of the man in the booth grew heavier, pressing down on her lungs, making it impossible to draw enough air. As she approached the table, Lincoln's gaze slowly shifted from the window and locked onto her. His eyes were like twin black holes, consuming whatever light managed to reach them. Leah's hands trembled so violently that the dark liquid inside the carafe sloshed against the glass rim, threatening to spill. "Coffee, sir," she managed to whisper, her voice entirely devoid of its usual warmth, sounding instead like dry leaves scraping across pavement. Lincoln did not verbally respond. He simply offered a microscopic, almost imperceptible nod. Leah reached forward, her left hand hovering over the rim of the heavy ceramic mug to steady it, while her right hand tipped the heavy pot. But as she leaned in, the harsh angle of her movement pulled at her stiff collar. The top button, strained to its absolute limit, finally gave way with a tiny, sharp snap. The fabric fell open, exposing the pale, fragile column of her neck. In that exact, agonizing split second, two things happened simultaneously. The excruciating, burning pain radiating from her ribs flared into a blinding, white-hot agony that completely short-circuited her exhausted nervous system. And Lincoln's dark, calculating eyes fell directly upon the gruesome, jagged ring of dark purple and sickening yellow bruises that encircled her throat like a violent collar. Leah felt the last remaining ounce of her strength evaporate into thin air. The diner, the men, the fluorescent lights, everything dissolved into a rushing, roaring tunnel of darkness. The heavy glass coffee pot slipped from her numb, lifeless fingers, shattering onto the floor in an explosion of scalding liquid and razor-sharp shards. Her knees buckled outward, completely giving way. She was falling, tumbling into the dark, silent abyss, welcoming the sudden, peaceful oblivion. But she never hit the ground. Before her body could collide with the broken glass and hard floor, a blur of motion eclipsed the lights. Powerful, unyielding arms wrapped securely around her fragile frame, catching her mid-fall. The scent of rain and cold power enveloped her. She heard the sharp, terrifying command of his voice cutting through the fog of her fading consciousness, demanding to know who had broken her before the darkness completely swallowed her whole. The transition from total darkness to waking consciousness was not a gentle fading of shadows, but a slow, agonizing drag through a swamp of pain. The first thing Leah registered was the profound, aching throb in her ribcage, a constant, fiery reminder of the violence she had endured mere days ago. The second thing she noticed was the scent. Gone was the suffocating stench of stale grease, bleached floors, and burnt coffee that permanently stained the air of the diner. Instead, she inhaled the subtle, expensive aroma of aged leather, cedarwood, and the faint, lingering metallic tang of rain. It was a masculine scent, overwhelming but strangely grounding. Leah's eyelids fluttered, feeling as heavy as lead doors. She forced them open, squinting against the dim, warm light. She was no longer lying on the cold, cracked linoleum floor of the diner. She was resting on an incredibly soft, sprawling leather sofa. A thick, heavy wool blanket draped carefully over her trembling form. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the heavy fog of unconsciousness from her brain. The room was massive, lined with dark, imposing mahogany bookshelves and heavy velvet curtains that completely blocked out the raging storm outside. A fire crackled softly in a massive stone hearth across the room, casting long, dancing shadows that played across the walls. Panic, sudden and visceral, seized her chest. She shot up into a sitting position, a terrified gasp tearing from her raw throat as the sudden movement pulled fiercely at her battered ribs. She clutched the wool blanket to her chest, her wide, frightened eyes darting wildly around the unfamiliar room, searching for an escape route, searching for the danger she knew was always lurking just out of sight. "Don't move too quickly. You'll only agitate your injuries." The voice came from the darkest corner of the room, near the large window. It was low, smooth, and carried an undeniable, terrifying weight of absolute authority. Leah froze. Her breath caught painfully in her throat. She slowly turned her head, her heart hammering against her ribs like a drumline. Lincoln stepped out of the shadows and into the warm, flickering glow of the firelight. He had discarded his heavy, rain-soaked overcoat. He wore a crisp, dark dress shirt, the sleeves casually rolled up to his forearms, revealing skin corded with lean muscle and faint, white scars. He held a crystal tumbler filled with amber liquid in one hand, his posture entirely relaxed, yet exuding the coiled, dangerous energy of a strike-ready viper. He moved toward her with agonizing slowness, his dark eyes never once breaking contact with hers. Leah pressed herself back into the corner of the leather sofa, making herself as small as physically possible. The man standing before her was not just a patron. He was the undisputed king of the city's dark underbelly, a man whose mere whisper could topple empires or end lives, and she was trapped in a room with him. Where am I?" she stammered, her voice barely a cracked, trembling whisper. She pulled the blanket higher, instinctively trying to cover the exposed bruises on her neck, though she knew the collar of her uniform was already ruined. "You're safe," Lincoln replied quietly. The words were simple, but they sounded utterly foreign coming from his lips. He stopped a few feet from the sofa, keeping a respectful but commanding distance. "You collapsed in the diner. My men and I brought you to my private office. It's above the club. I had a doctor look at you while you were unconscious." Leah's blood ran completely ice-cold. A doctor. The doctor would have seen everything: the bruised ribs, the cracked collarbone, the mottled, horrifying canvas of purple and yellow that painted her torso and throat. You had someone touch me?" she breathed, sheer terror lacing her words. "You had no right." Lincoln's expression remained perfectly, stoically impassive, a mask of carved granite. "You were unresponsive, pale, and barely breathing. Given the severe nature of the injuries clearly visible on your neck, I assumed there were more. I was not going to leave you bleeding out on the floor of a filthy diner." The doctor confirmed 3 fractured ribs, deep tissue contusions, and signs of repeated strangulation. He took a slow, deliberate sip from his glass, the ice clinking sharply against the crystal. "So, I will ask you again. The same question you failed to answer before you lost consciousness." He set the glass down on a side table with a solid, echoing thud and took 1 step closer. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. "Who hurt you, Leah?" The sound of her name on his lips sent a strange, involuntary shiver down her spine. It wasn't a threat, but it wasn't a comfort either. It was a demand for truth. Leah averted her eyes, staring fiercely at the intricate pattern of the Persian rug beneath the coffee table. The silence stretched between them, thick, suffocating, and heavy with unspoken dread. If she told him about Vance, if she even breathed his name in this room, the consequences would be catastrophic. Vance wasn't just cruel, he was a parasite, heavily entrenched in the lower levels of the city's loan shark operations. If a man like Lincoln got involved, the streets would run red, and Vance would undoubtedly find a way to make Leah pay for every single drop of blood. "I fell," she lied. The words tasted like ash and copper in her mouth. It was the same pathetic, hollow lie she told Sam at the diner, the same lie she told the pharmacist when she bought painkillers, down a flight of concrete stairs. It was dark. I was carrying heavy boxes. Lincoln didn't yell. He didn't scoff. He simply stared at her, an eerie, unnatural stillness settling over him. For a long, terrifying moment, he didn't blink. The silence became a physical weight, pressing down on her bruised chest until she felt she might suffocate. "You fell?" he repeated, his voice dropping an octave, slipping into a low, dangerous register that made the hairs on Leah's arms stand on end. "You fell down the stairs, and somehow the edges of the steps wrapped themselves completely around your throat and squeezed until the capillaries burst under your skin." He leaned forward, bracing his strong hands on the back of a leather armchair, bringing his face closer to hers. The raw intensity in his dark eyes was paralyzing. "I have spent my entire life surrounded by violence, Leah. I know what a fist does to a jaw. I know what a blade does to flesh. And I know with absolute certainty what the hands of a coward look like when they wrap around a woman's throat." His voice was a low, rumbling growl, vibrating with a tightly leashed, terrifying fury. "Do not insult my intelligence by lying to my face. Who put their hands on you?" Tears, hot and entirely unbidden, pricked at the corners of Leah's eyes. The exhaustion, the pain, the overwhelming terror of her daily existence finally breached the heavy dam she had built around her emotions. She squeezed her eyes shut, a single, stray tear escaping and carving a hot path down her pale cheek. "Please," she whispered, her voice breaking entirely, crumbling into a pathetic, desperate sob. "Please, just let me go. If he finds out I'm here, if he thinks I talk to anyone, he'll kill me." He promised he would. Lincoln slowly straightened up, the sudden, raw vulnerability in her voice striking something deep and buried within the dark, heavily armored vault of his chest. He looked at the trembling, broken woman huddled on his sofa, her spirit crushed under the weight of an unseen monster. He had seen countless men beg for their lives, seen hardened killers weep in fear, but the pure, unadulterated terror radiating from Leah was different. It was an innocent, caged desperation. He didn't push her further. He recognized a cornered animal when he saw one. Pushing now would only make her bolt blindly into the dark. "No one is going to kill you," Lincoln stated, his voice returning to a steady, calm, but immovably firm tone. "Not tonight, and not ever again. As long as you are under this roof, you will stay here. You will rest, and when you are ready to tell me the name of the man who did this, I will ensure he never breathes the same air as you again." Despite Lincoln's firm, commanding offer of sanctuary, the sheer, paralyzing terror of what Vance would do if she didn't return to the apartment eclipsed even her fear of the Mafia boss standing before her. Vance wasn't a man who accepted defiance. He was a volatile, explosive debt collector who viewed Leah not as a human being, but as collateral. Her deceased father had racked up gambling debts that Vance now viciously claimed as his own personal inheritance, using Leah's minimum wage diner tips to slowly, agonizingly bleed the debt dry, while using her physical pain to assert his pathetic dominance. After an hour of tense, exhausting negotiation in Lincoln's quiet office, Leah had successfully managed to convince him to let her leave. She had lied, again, spinning a frantic, desperate web of deceit. She claimed her injuries were from a random mugging in the alley behind her building, a one-time incident, and that she desperately needed to return to her younger sister, a complete fabrication who was waiting for her at home. Lincoln had stared right through her frantic lies, his dark eyes analyzing every micro-expression of panic on her pale face. He knew she was lying, but he also recognized the frantic, trapped animal desperation in her eyes. Forcing her to stay against her will would only terrify her further, breaking whatever fragile thread of trust he might have accidentally established. He had let her go, but not without sending Eli, his most trusted, silent, and lethal shadow, to follow her home and watch the building. The rain had finally slowed to a dismal, freezing drizzle as Leah unlocked the heavy, rusted metal door of her tenement building. The hallway smelled strongly of boiled cabbage, damp rot, and stale cigarette smoke. The flickering fluorescent bulb overhead buzzed like an angry hornet, casting twitching, harsh shadows against the peeling yellow wallpaper. Every step up, the 3 flights of stairs, was pure, unadulterated agony. The pain medication Lincoln's doctor had given her had dulled the sharpest edges of the fire in her ribs, but the deep, bone-weary ache remained a constant, heavy companion. She reached her door, apartment 3B, and her heart immediately plummeted into her stomach, a cold dread washing over her. The cheap, flimsy deadbolt was unlocked. The door was slightly ajar, a thin sliver of absolute darkness spilling out into the dimly lit hallway. Vance was inside. Leah's breath hitched in her bruised throat. She considered turning around. She considered running back down the stairs, out into the freezing street, and hiding in an alley. But where would she go? The diner was closed. She had exactly $4 in her pocket, and if Vance realized she had run, he would simply wait for her. He always waited. He enjoyed the hunt. With a trembling, numb hand, she slowly pushed the door open. The hinges screamed in protest, a long, agonizing creak that shattered the dead silence of the apartment. The living room was pitch black, save for the faint, sickly orange glow of the street lamp filtering through the dirty, cracked window. Vance was sitting on the sagging, moth-eaten armchair in the corner. She couldn't see his face, only the glowing red cherry of his cigarette, flaring bright with every slow, deliberate drag he took. "You're late," his voice slithered through the darkness, greasy, wet, and utterly devoid of anything human. I had to work an extra shift," Leah lied, her voice shaking uncontrollably. She closed the door softly behind her, trapping herself in the cage. She kept her back pressed firmly against the peeling paint of the door, her eyes adjusting to the gloom. "Sam needed me to clean the grease traps. I'm sorry." Vance slowly stood up. He was a tall man, painfully gaunt, with nervous, twitchy energy that made him unpredictable and highly dangerous. He dropped the cigarette onto the worn, stained carpet and crushed it out beneath the heel of his heavy boot. He took a step toward her, the floorboards groaning under his weight. "You're lying to me, Leah," he purred, his voice dropping into that terrifyingly soft, dangerous register that always preceded the violence. "I walked by the diner 2 hours ago. The lights were out. The door was locked. Sam's ancient Buick wasn't in the lot. "So, where exactly have you been, little bird?" Leah's mind raced frantically, searching for a plausible excuse, a story that wouldn't end in him raising his heavy fists. "I was walking. I was just walking. My head hurt. I needed air." Vance closed the distance between them in 2 long, predatory strides. Before Leah could react, before she could even raise her weak, trembling arms to defend herself, his hand shot out in the darkness. His long, bony fingers clamped violently onto her left shoulder, his thumb digging brutally into the soft hollow of her collarbone. Leah gasped, a sharp, choked cry of pure agony escaping her lips as the pressure sent white-hot lightning radiating down her arm and across her cracked ribs. "You think I'm stupid?" Vance hissed, leaning in close. His breath smelled nauseatingly of cheap whiskey and rotting teeth. "You think you can just wander the streets while you owe me? Your old man died owing me 10 grand, Leah. You don't get to take walks. You don't get to take breaks. You work, and you pay me. Every single cent. I have the money." She choked out, tears of sheer pain blurring her vision. She reached desperately into her apron pocket with her free hand, pulling out a crumpled, pathetic wad of sweaty dollar bills. "Here, it's $30. It's all my tips." Vance looked at the small, crumpled pile of bills in her shaking hand. He scoffed, a dark, ugly sound of pure contempt. He snatched the money from her grasp and shoved it carelessly into his pocket. Then, without any warning, his grip on her shoulder shifted, his hand slid upward, his rough, calloused fingers wrapping violently around her throat, pressing directly over the deep, healing bruises he had left there 3 days ago. Leah couldn't breathe. The air in the room was instantly cut off. She clawed desperately at his iron wrist with both hands, her fingernails digging frantically into his skin. But his grip was like a steel vice. $30 is an insult, Leah, Vance growled, his face inches from hers, his eyes wide and completely unhinged. "You need to try harder. Maybe I need to teach you another lesson about respect, about who owns you." Down on the street below, heavily concealed within the deep, impenetrable shadows of an abandoned storefront, Eli sat perfectly still in the driver's seat of a black, unmarked sedan. Through the high-powered, military-grade binoculars pressed to his eyes, he watched the entire scene unfold through the dirty, uncurtained window of apartment 3B. He saw the violent grab. He saw the sudden chokehold. He watched the frail silhouette of the waitress struggling helplessly against the taller, violently aggressive man. Eli lowered the binoculars. His expression remained a mask of pure, cold indifference, but his hands moved with rapid, practiced precision. He picked up the encrypted satellite phone resting on the passenger seat and dialed a single, private number. It rang exactly once. "Speak," Lincoln's voice commanded. Low, sharp, and heavily laced with a dark, impending violence. "She went home," Eli reported quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "Apartment 3B. There's a man inside. Tall, aggressive. He's putting his hands on her, boss, by the neck. It looks bad." A thick, terrifyingly heavy silence fell over the line. For 5 long seconds, there was nothing but the faint crackle of static and the sound of Lincoln's slow, measured breathing. When Lincoln finally spoke, the chilling, absolute coldness in his voice could have frozen the blood in a man's veins. "Go through the door, Eli. Break his arms, but do not kill him. I want him alive. I'm on my way." Lincoln stood alone in his darkened office, the encrypted phone still tight in his grip. The image of Leah collapsing onto the diner floor, her incredibly frail frame, the horrific canvas of bruises around her throat, played on a continuous, maddening loop in his mind. He was a man of cold, calculated logic. Emotion was a liability. But tonight, the intricately constructed walls of his discipline had shattered entirely. He knew exactly who Vance was. A bottom feeder, a pathetic loan shark who used fear to extract small sums from the desperate. He was a parasite, and he had latched onto Leah. His phone buzzed sharply. "Status," Lincoln demanded. "It's done, boss," Eli's calm voice reported. "Target neutralized. Compound fractures in both arms. He won't be using his hands for a very long time." But the girl? She's in deep shock. Hyperventilating. "Stay exactly where you are," Lincoln commanded. "I am 5 minutes away." He practically tore out of the club. The black SUV screeched through the rain-slicked streets, ignoring red lights. Lincoln was past the point of logic. He was driven by a violent, protective rage. When he reached the 3rd floor of Leah's dilapidated tenement, the door to apartment 3B lay completely shattered on the hallway floor. Vance was a broken, groaning heap in the center of the living room, but Lincoln didn't spare him a single glance. His dark eyes instantly found Leah. She was huddled in the furthest corner of the squalid kitchen, her knees pulled tight to her chest, rocking slightly and whimpering. She looked hopelessly shattered. "Get that piece of trash out of here," Lincoln signaled Eli with a sharp flick of his chin. Once the heavy footsteps faded, Lincoln slowly removed his dark overcoat, lowering himself to one knee. He needed to appear smaller, less threatening. "Leah," he said softly. His voice, a steady baritone. She flinched violently. "Please," she sobbed. "Please, don't hurt me. Just don't let him touch me again. Look at me, Leah," Lincoln urged quietly, becoming a grounding anchor in her chaotic storm. Trembling, she lifted her head, meeting his eyes. "He is never going to touch you again. I am taking you out of here. You are never coming back to this place." Staring at the most dangerous man in the city, Leah felt a strange, impossible flicker of safety. Slowly, infinitesimally, she nodded her head. The transition to Lincoln's heavily fortified estate was a blur. Leah sat rigidly in the SUV, hyper-aware of Lincoln's imposing but quiet presence beside her. When they finally arrived, he didn't wait for his driver. He opened her door himself, offering a large, scarred hand. Trembling, she took it. His grip was shockingly gentle. Inside the massive, modern fortress, Leah felt entirely out of place, a battered stray dragged into a king's palace. Lincoln instructed a housekeeper, Maria, to draw a bath and prepare food, but seeing the sudden, wild panic in Leah's eyes at the thought of separation, he stopped. "I am right down the hall in my study," he assured her softly. "You are entirely safe here, Leah." But despite the hot bath and the soft clothes, sleep was impossible. The silence of the massive house was deafening. At 2 a.m., unable to stand the quiet any longer, she padded softly down the hall, following the sliver of golden light beneath Lincoln's heavy oak door. Before she could even raise her hand to knock, his voice drifted out. "The door is open, Leah." She pushed it open to find him sitting by a roaring fire, a crystal glass resting on his knee. He looked exhausted, but deeply alert. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, gesturing to the empty leather armchair opposite his. Leah sank into it, pulling her knees defensively to her chest. "It's too quiet. I keep waiting for the door to get kicked in." Lincoln leaned forward, his jaw tightening visibly. "Vance is gone," he stated, the words carrying a terrifying, absolute finality. "He will never step foot in this city again. His operations have been dismantled. Your debt is erased. You are completely, unconditionally free of him." Leah stared at him, her mind struggling to process the sheer magnitude of his words. "Free? He won't just walk away," she stammered. "He didn't have a choice," Lincoln replied coldly, a brief glimpse of the ruthless boss surfacing. "He is no longer a threat to anyone." Tears welled up, hot and overwhelming. The suffocating weight that had crushed her chest for 2 agonizing years suddenly vanished into thin air. The relief was so profound, so physically overwhelming, that she began to violently sob, burying her face in her hands. Lincoln didn't offer hollow platitudes. He stood up, crossed the short distance between them, and carefully knelt on the floor beside her chair. Hesitating for only a fraction of a second, he rested his large, warm hand heavily on her trembling shoulder. "Breathe, Leah," he murmured, his voice a low, steady rumble that vibrated through her. "You survived. It's over. Just breathe." She leaned into his touch, crying until she had nothing left, while the most dangerous man in the city remained perfectly still, holding her broken pieces together with terrifying gentleness. The morning light filtering through the heavy drapes of the guest room was a soft, pale gold, completely devoid of the harsh, blinding glare Leah was accustomed to waking up to. She stirred slowly beneath the massive, down-filled duvet, her mind momentarily blank. Then, the rush of memories hit her. The diner, the broken glass, Vance's hands, the terrifying rescue, and Lincoln's quiet, steadfast presence in the firelit study. She sat up sharply, wincing as her stiff ribs pulled tight. The physical pain was still sharply present, a dull, fiery ache radiating from her chest and neck, but the suffocating, paralyzing dread that normally accompanied waking was entirely gone. She swung her legs over the side of the bed, her bare feet sinking into the unimaginably thick plush carpet. Maria had left fresh clothes draped over the back of an armchair. A soft cashmere sweater, well-fitted dark jeans, and warm wool socks. It was a staggering upgrade from her threadbare uniform and cheap synthetic shirts. Leah dressed slowly, running her hands reverently over the ridiculously soft fabric, feeling entirely out of place, like an imposter playing a role she wasn't cast for. When she finally gathered the courage to navigate the massive, silent hallways of the estate, she followed the faint, rich aroma of freshly roasted coffee and bacon. The kitchen was a sprawling, chef-grade marvel of brushed steel and pristine white marble. Lincoln was sitting alone at the large island, casually reading a newspaper, a cup of black coffee steaming in front of him. He wore a simple gray Henley that stretched tight across his broad, heavily muscled shoulders. Without the dark suits and the terrifying entourage, he looked remarkably human, yet still possessed a quiet, dense gravity that pulled all the oxygen from the room. He looked up as she hovered hesitantly in the doorway. The hard lines around his mouth softened instantly. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble. "Did you sleep?" "Yes," Leah replied softly, stepping nervously into the vast kitchen. "Thank you. For everything. The clothes, the room, it's nothing," Lincoln dismissed quietly, folding the newspaper and pushing it aside. "Maria is preparing breakfast. Sit." Leah climbed onto a high stool opposite him, feeling painfully exposed under the bright, recessed lighting. She instinctively pulled the collar of the cashmere sweater higher, attempting to conceal the ugly, mottled bruising on her neck, though she knew he had already seen it. Lincoln noticed the defensive movement, his dark eyes tracking the subtle gesture, but he said nothing to draw attention to it. Maria bustled in, setting down plates of eggs, bacon, and thick toast, before pouring Leah a large cup of coffee. The silence between Lincoln and Leah was heavy, not hostile, but thick with the unspoken, chaotic events of the previous night. Leah picked at her food, her stomach still a tight knot of lingering anxiety. "You don't have to be afraid of me, Leah," Lincoln said suddenly, breaking the silence. He wasn't looking at her. He was staring intently at his coffee cup, his large hands resting flat on the cool marble counter. Leah stopped, her fork hovering in the air. You're not exactly a safe person to be around," she said, the words tumbling out before her fear filter could stop them. She instantly regretted it, bracing herself for a cold, sharp reprimand. Instead, Lincoln let out a short, hollow, utterly joyless laugh. He finally looked up, his dark eyes locking onto hers with a startling, raw intensity. "No, I am not a safe person. I deal in violence. I deal in shadows. The world I inhabit is entirely devoid of mercy." He paused, leaning slightly forward, his voice dropping into a register of absolute, terrifying sincerity. "But that violence will never, under any circumstances, be directed at you. The men who work for me, the enemies who hunt me, they are part of a game you will never be forced to play. In this house, in my presence, you are untouchable." Leah stared at him, desperately searching his carved, stoic face for a lie, for a hidden agenda. She was so used to men wanting something in return for their help. Vance wanted her money and her submission. The diner patrons wanted a smile with their cheap coffee. But Lincoln seemed to want absolutely nothing from her. "Why?" she asked, her voice a small, fragile tremor. "Why are you doing this? I'm just a waitress. I have nothing to offer you. I can't repay you for taking care of Vance, or for this room, or the doctor." Lincoln's expression tightened, a dark, heavy shadow passing swiftly over his eyes, as if recalling a deeply buried, painful memory. He looked away, staring blankly toward the large windows overlooking the manicured, rain-soaked gardens. "Many years ago," Lincoln began, his voice incredibly quiet, laced with a heavy, profound sorrow that seemed entirely incongruous with his terrifying reputation. "Before I built all of this, I had a younger sister. Her name was Elena. She was small, like you, quiet. She got involved with a man who was very much like Vance, a coward who used his fists to feel tall." Leah's breath caught in her bruised throat. She stopped breathing, entirely captivated by the sudden, raw vulnerability radiating from the most dangerous man she had ever met. "I was young. I was trying to build my territory. I was arrogant, and I was deeply distracted," Lincoln continued, his hands slowly curling into tight, white-knuckled fists on the marble counter. "I didn't see the signs. I didn't see the bruises she hid under heavy scarves. When I finally figured it out, when I finally went to pull her out of that house, I was exactly 3 hours too late." He had beaten her to death over a misplaced set of car keys. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the massive kitchen. Leah felt tears immediately spring to her eyes, her heart shattering for the massive, terrifying man sitting across from her. "I tore that man apart with my bare hands," Lincoln stated, his voice devoid of emotion, a cold, chilling statement of absolute fact. "It took him 2 agonizing days to die in a warehouse down by the docks. But it didn't bring Elena back. It didn't fix the fact that I had failed to protect the one person who relied entirely on me." He slowly turned his head, his dark, intense eyes locking onto Leah's pale, tear-streaked face. The raw, unprotected emotion in his gaze was staggering. "When you collapsed in that diner," Lincoln whispered, the words carrying the immense, crushing weight of a decade of deep, unresolvable guilt. "And I saw those jagged bruises on your neck. I saw Elena. I saw the same fear, the same desperate, trapped exhaustion. I couldn't save my sister, Leah, but I could save you. And I refuse to let another coward break someone while I stand by and watch." Leah reached across the cold marble island, her trembling, scarred fingers gently covering his massive, clenched fist. It was a monumental act of courage, a massive leap of faith for a woman who had been conditioned to flinch at sudden movements. Lincoln went entirely rigid at the contact, his breath hitching slightly, before he slowly, deliberately turned his large hand over, gently weaving his long, calloused fingers through hers. "You did save me," Leah whispered, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "Thank you." The following 3 days at the estate passed in a strange, quiet, almost surreal blur of healing and adjustment. For the first time in years, Leah didn't have to set an alarm for 4:00 a.m. She didn't have to stand on aching feet for 14 hours, dodging groping hands and wiping greasy counters. She spent her hours reading in the massive, sunlit library, walking the expansive, heavily guarded grounds, and sleeping. The deep, purple and yellow bruising on her neck began to slowly fade into a sickly, mottled green, and the fiery, sharp pain in her ribs dulled to a manageable, persistent ache. But the most profound shift was not physical. It was the slow, tentative dismantling of the heavy, fortified walls around her mind. Lincoln was a constant, steady presence, yet entirely unobtrusive. He spent his days managing his vast, dark empire from his study, behind closed doors, shielding her from the violent realities of his life. But in the evenings, he would seek her out. They would sit by the massive fire in the library, the silence stretching comfortably between them. He didn't push her to speak, didn't demand the gritty, painful details of her past. He simply offered his presence, a massive, grounding anchor in the chaotic storm of her recovery. On the 4th evening, the rain had returned, a slow, melodic drumbeat against the massive windows. Leah was sitting on the plush rug in front of the hearth, a heavy blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders, staring blindly into the dancing flames. Lincoln sat in his usual leather armchair behind her, a half-empty glass of scotch resting in his hand. The silence was heavy, but no longer suffocating. "I was in college," Leah said suddenly, her voice very quiet, breaking the long silence. It was the first time she had actively volunteered information about her past without being prompted. Lincoln shifted slightly in his chair, leaning forward, giving her his absolute, undivided attention. But he remained silent, allowing her the necessary space to speak. "I was studying art history," she continued, her eyes fixed entirely on the fire, afraid that looking at him would break her resolve. "My father was a good man, mostly, but he had a sickness, the gambling. He thought he could win enough to pay for my tuition, to give us a better life after my mother died. He got involved with the wrong people, with Vance's boss." She pulled the blanket tighter around her fragile shoulders, a physical shield against the painful memories. "When the debt got too high, they started threatening us. My father panicked. He tried to run. He suffered a massive heart attack on the subway platform, trying to get to a bus terminal. The day after his funeral, Vance showed up at our apartment. He told me the debt didn't die with my father. It transferred to me." Leah's voice trembled slightly, but she forced herself to continue, needing to purge the poison from her system. "I had to drop out. I took the job at the diner because Sam paid cash under the table, and Vance couldn't garnish my wages legally. But Vance, he liked the control. It wasn't just about the money. He liked knowing he owned me. He liked showing up when I least expected it. He liked leaving marks. So I would always remember who I belonged to." A sharp, violent crack echoed through the quiet room. Leah flinched violently, whipping her head around. Lincoln was staring at his hand. The thick crystal scotch glass had shattered completely under the sheer, sudden pressure of his grip. Amber liquid and shards of glass were scattered across the Persian rug and his dark trousers. A thin, bright red line of blood trickled slowly down his palm. His face was a mask of pure, terrifying, murderous rage. His jaw was clenched so tightly the muscles jumped beneath his skin, and his dark eyes were completely black, devoid of any light. Leah scrambled to her feet, entirely forgetting her fear of his violence in the face of his injury. She rushed to his side, dropping to her knees beside his chair. "Lincoln, you're bleeding." She reached for his massive hand. her small fingers gently but firmly prying his rigid fingers open to assess the damage. He didn't resist her touch. He stared down at her, the violent, dark storm in his eyes slowly receding as he focused on the gentle, completely unguarded concern on her face. "It's nothing," he muttered, his voice a harsh, gravelly rasp, heavily strained with suppressed emotion. "It's not nothing. There's glass in your palm," Leah scolded softly, entirely shocking herself with her own boldness. She grabbed a clean linen napkin from the side table and gently pressed it against the wound. "Hold this. I'll go get the first aid kit from Maria." "Leah," Lincoln said quietly, his large, uninjured hand reaching out and gently catching her wrist before she could stand up. His grip was feather-light, a stark contrast to the violence he had just displayed. She froze, looking up into his eyes. The anger was entirely gone, replaced by a profound, overwhelming sorrow and an intensity that made her breath catch painfully in her throat. "I am so deeply sorry that you had to endure that," Lincoln whispered, the words carrying a heavy, absolute sincerity that shattered the final remaining wall around Leah's heart. "You are incredibly brave, stronger than any of the men I employ." Leah stared at him, the heat radiating from his hand burning through the sleeve of her sweater. He wasn't looking at her with pity. He wasn't looking at her as a victim. He was looking at her with absolute, unwavering respect. "I didn't feel brave," she admitted, her voice trembling. "I just felt terrified. Every single day. Surviving is the greatest act of bravery there is," Lincoln said softly. He slowly moved his hand from her wrist, his long, calloused fingers gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. His touch was incredibly hesitant, as if he expected her to pull away, as if he was terrified of breaking her further. Leah didn't pull away. For the first time in years, she leaned into the touch of a man, closing her eyes as a deep, profound sense of safety settled heavily over her exhausted soul. In the quiet warmth of the library, surrounded by the shadows of a violent empire, Leah finally allowed herself to believe that the nightmare was truly over. The fragile peace of the estate was a beautiful illusion. Taking Vance out had been an act of necessary protection, but it was also a blatant, aggressive violation of territorial treaties. It was Tuesday afternoon. Leah was in the sunroom, sketching quietly, when Eli burst into Lincoln's study. His face was tight, his jaw clenched. "The Russians." "Anton's crew," Eli said urgently. "They burned the diner to the ground an hour ago." Sam barely made it out. "They are actively hunting Leah to make a public example of her." Lincoln stood up, a dark, murderous aura erupting from him. "Double the perimeter guards. Lock down the gates. If a single Russian sets foot on my grass, they die." He found Leah in the sunroom. "We need to move to the secure bunker beneath the house," he said steadily. "Right now." Her smile vanished instantly. "Vance? Vance is gone." "This is something else," Lincoln interrupted firmly, taking her trembling hands. "My men have the house secured, but protocol dictates we move until the threat is permanently eliminated." Instead of breaking down, Leah took a deep, shuddering breath. Her time at the estate had fortified her. "Okay," she said, "let's go." Down in the subterranean bunker, Lincoln strapped a heavy Kevlar vest over his shirt and grabbed an assault rifle. "Stay here. I am going to send a very loud, very permanent message to Anton." For the next several hours, Leah sat completely frozen, watching the silent security monitors. She saw flashes of light in the distant tree line and watched Lincoln's men move with terrifying, lethal precision. She wasn't afraid of the men attacking the house. She was terrified for the man risking his entire empire for her. When the heavy steel door finally opened, Lincoln walked in, smelling heavily of gunpowder and rain. entirely unharmed. He dropped the rifle and walked straight toward Leah. He didn't speak. He simply wrapped his massive arms around her, pulling her fiercely against his Kevlar-clad chest. Leah buried her face in his shoulder, holding on to him as if he were the only solid thing left in the world. "It's over," Lincoln rumbled against her ear. "Anton is handled. No one will ever come looking for you again. I swear it on my life." The aftermath of the attack brought a profound, heavy shift to the estate. The immediate, violent threat was entirely neutralized. Anton's syndicate had been thoroughly decimated, a brutal, undeniable message broadcasted to the entire criminal underworld. Whatever belonged to Lincoln was entirely, unconditionally untouchable. And everyone now knew that Leah belonged with him. 2 weeks had passed since the night in the bunker. The physical bruises on Leah's neck had completely faded, leaving behind only the ghost of a memory. The fractured ribs were healed, allowing her to breathe deeply without the sharp, stabbing reminder of her past. But the most significant healing was internal. The hypervigilance, the constant, sickening expectation of violence, had finally drained from her posture. She no longer flinched when a door closed too loudly. She no longer scanned rooms for escape routes. She was standing on the expansive stone terrace overlooking the massive, manicured gardens, holding a cup of hot tea, watching the golden, early morning sun burn off the thick fog rolling down from the hills. The air was crisp, clean, and completely silent. Lincoln stepped out onto the terrace, his heavy footsteps muffled by the stone. He came to stand beside her, leaning his forearms against the cold stone balustrade, looking out at the sprawling horizon. He was dressed casually, the hard, terrifying edges of the mob boss softened by the morning light. "The diner is being rebuilt," Lincoln said quietly, breaking the peaceful silence. "Sam is managing the construction. I made sure he received a very generous insurance payout. He won't have to worry about money for the rest of his life." Leah turned to look at him, her heart swelling with a deep, profound gratitude. He had fixed everything. He had systematically dismantled every single nightmare that had plagued her existence. "Thank you. Sam is a good man. He didn't deserve to lose his livelihood because of me. He didn't lose it because of you. He lost it because cowards think violence is power," Lincoln corrected firmly, turning his head to meet her gaze. "And you don't owe me any thanks, Leah. I did what was necessary." He turned fully toward her, his expression suddenly incredibly serious, carrying a heavy, unresolved tension. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out a thick, white envelope, placing it gently on the stone railing between them. "What is this?" Leah asked, a sudden cold spike of anxiety piercing her chest. "It's entirely untraceable cash, a new passport, and heavily secured documents establishing a new identity," Lincoln explained, his voice perfectly steady, though his dark eyes betrayed a deep, hidden turmoil. "You are completely free, Leah. Vance is dead. Anton is broken. The debt is erased. There is absolutely nothing holding you here anymore. You can go anywhere in the world. Start over. Go back to school. Live a normal, quiet life, entirely free from the shadows of my world." Leah stared at the thick white envelope. It was everything she had dreamed of for 2 agonizing years. It was an absolute, unconditional exit ticket from the nightmare. She looked up from the envelope to Lincoln's face. He was staring at her with an intensity that took her breath away, bracing himself for her departure, fully expecting her to take the out he was providing. He was a creature of darkness, entirely convinced he was unfit to hold on to something as bright and fragile as her. "You're sending me away," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "I am giving you your freedom," Lincoln corrected, his jaw tightening painfully. "My world is violent, Leah. It is dangerous, and it is entirely unforgiving. You have suffered enough violence for one lifetime. You deserve to live in the light, and the light does not exist where I stand." Leah looked at the terrifying, heavily scarred man who had torn apart the city's criminal underworld just to ensure she could sleep peacefully. She saw the deep, lingering sorrow in his eyes, the heavy burden of a man who believed he was entirely unlovable. She slowly reached out, but she didn't touch the envelope. Instead, she placed her small, warm hand flat against the center of his chest, directly over his hammering heart. "You told me that surviving is the greatest act of bravery," Leah said softly, her voice gaining strength, ringing with an absolute, unwavering certainty. "I survived Vance. I survived the fear. But I didn't start actually living until I woke up in your study." Lincoln froze, his breath catching in his throat, his large hand instinctively coming up to cover hers, pressing it firmly against his chest. "I don't want a new identity. I don't want to run away. I don't want a quiet, normal life if you aren't in it," she continued, her eyes completely locked onto his, completely devoid of fear. "You think you're nothing but darkness, Lincoln. But when I was drowning in the dark, you were the only light I saw." A profound, staggering relief washed over Lincoln's harsh features, cracking the unyielding foundation of his stoicism. The heavy, protective walls he had built around his deadened heart completely shattered. He slowly, hesitantly reached out, his large hands gently cupping her face, his thumbs tracing the soft line of her jawline. "If you stay," Lincoln whispered, his voice incredibly rough, raw with exposed emotion, "I will never be able to let you go. I will burn down the rest of the world to keep you safe." "Then let it burn," Leah whispered back, stepping fully into his embrace, wrapping her arms securely around his neck. Lincoln pulled her fiercely against his chest, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, finally holding her not as a fragile, broken thing he needed to protect, but as the strong, fiercely brave woman who had somehow managed to save him. The storm outside had finally passed, and for the first time in his violent, chaotic life, the King of the Shadows had found his peace. In the end, true strength isn't defined by the force of a punch or the size of an empire, but by the quiet courage to protect the vulnerable and the immense bravery required to let yourself be loved after being broken. Leah and Lincoln found light in the darkest of places, proving that even the deepest wounds can heal when met with genuine, unconditional safety. If this story moved you, please hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a deeply emotional, protective romance, and subscribe for more intense, cinematic stories every week.